Over the course of a career spanning more than 4 decades, Richard Widmark's transformation from a menacing villain to a beloved portrayer of Western icons was as dramatic and compelling as anything Hollywood could have scripted. He brought intensity, complexity, and a dash of danger to roles that reflected a changing America, one that was discovering the darkness within itself, but still held tight to the romance of the frontier. Today, let's take a deep dive into how this shy Midwestern boy turned into a Hollywood legend, exploring the hidden corners of his life story, the triumphs and tragedies he faced, and the extraordinary legacy he left behind. It all began in Sunrise Township, Minnesota, on December 26, 1914. Richard Widmark arrived as the first child of Carl and Ethel May Widmark. His father, Carl, was of Swedish descent, and his mother had deep English and Scottish roots. Together, they influenced a household that valued education, diligence, and a sense of measured calm. While some accounts emphasize that Widmark's father's work led the family to move around frequently, Richard spent much of his childhood in Princeton, Illinois. He was said to be shy and somewhat bookish, more comfortable reading a novel or listening to radio plays than roughhousing in the street. There's a story, only occasionally mentioned, that at around age 8, Richard discovered the joy of entertaining others during a local church event. He'd been roped into reciting a short skit, something comedic. Though terrified at first, he soon found himself enjoying the laughter. It was a spark, a silent promise to himself that acting might one day be his calling. Another pivotal moment arrived when Widmark was a teenager. In high school, he took a drama class mainly to fulfill an elective requirement. The instructor saw something special in him, a serious, introspective boy who could, when pressed, channel deep wells of feeling. Encouraged by this teacher, Widmark began performing in school plays, steadily losing his stage fright and discovering that the spotlight could be a place not of fear, but of self-expression. As he practiced enunciation, timing, and facial expressions, he also honed an inner discipline, qualities he'd carry with him throughout his life. By the time he graduated, college seemed like a natural next step. He ended up attending Lake Forest College, a liberal arts school near Chicago, where he deepened his love for performance by majoring in speech and drama. While some classmates saw showbiz as a flight of fancy, Widmark tackled it with the methodical approach of a Midwesterner, patient, deliberate, and determined. Even so, when he first ventured into the professional world of acting, the bright lights of New York overshadowed everything. He arrived in the city around the late 1930s, at a time when Broadway was the dreamland for many young hopefuls. Widmark picked up bits of stage experience, but at first he was disappointed by how difficult it was to land substantial roles. The competition was fierce. Tall, handsome men with a strong voice were a dime a dozen in audition halls. Yet he discovered a different path: radio. With its flexible casting processes, radio offered more immediate opportunities. Before television made its grand entrance, radio dramas, comedies, and variety shows were a vast arena of creative output. The voice was king, and casting directors were eager for new talent. Widmark's calm, resonant tone and ability to switch from gentle introspection to manic intensity impressed producers. He started showing up in radio dramas bit by bit, building a reputation as a reliable, dynamic performer. Throughout the early 1940s, as World War II drew the nation's focus, radio continued to thrive, and so did Widmark. He portrayed all manner of characters, from earnest young men to scheming crooks. This practice sharpened his instincts for pacing and tension. Radio is, after all, an art of suggestion, where tone and cadence can make or break a scene. At the same time, he never fully gave up on the stage. Around 1943, he made his Broadway debut in the play Kiss and Tell, which, though not a smash hit, provided him crucial stage experience. It was during these years that he also crossed paths with Jean Hazelwood, a writer who would later become his wife. They married in 1942 and eventually had a daughter named Anne. By all accounts, the relationship was supportive and warm. Jean, who had literary ambitions of her own, encouraged Richard to keep pushing for better roles and not settle for anonymity in radio dramas. Still, the transition from stage or radio to film was daunting. Hollywood was a fortress of established stars, guarded by demanding producers and longtime studio heads. But as the war concluded, a new wave of filmmakers sought fresh faces, craving the excitement of unpredictability. That's when a 20th Century Fox producer caught wind of Widmark's radio performances and decided to set up a screen test. To everyone's surprise, Widmark's quiet presence leapt off the celluloid. Even when he wasn't speaking, there was a tension in his eyes, a hint of trouble or sorrow or cunning that made it hard to look away. He signed a contract with Fox in 1947, one of those big break moments that define an actor's life forever. Fortune truly smiled on him when he landed the role of Tommy Udo in Kiss of Death, 1947. The film itself was a gritty noir masterpiece centered on an ex-con forced into an undercover deal to bring down a menacing gangster, Udo. Widmark's portrayal was sinister and electric, featuring an iconic cackle that seemed to bubble up from the darkest depths of his psyche. Audiences were simultaneously fascinated and terrified. In one chilling scene, Udo pushes an elderly woman in a wheelchair down a flight of stairs. It was an audacious depiction of cruelty, so brazen that it seared into the public consciousness. This was the era of the Hays Code, after all, which demanded moral clarity and often sanitized violence. Widmark's Udo subverted all that, hinting at a moral depravity that film noir was in part designed to expose. Critics raved about this new villain on the scene. Indeed, he scored an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, an extraordinary feat for a film debut. But a single role in Hollywood can be a double-edged sword. While it thrust Widmark into the limelight, it also risked typecasting him as a one-note psychopath. Studios love a proven commodity, and they saw how effectively Widmark could radiate menace. For a while, he took on roles in films like Roadhouse, 1948, and Night and the City, 1950, both of which kept him in the realm of morally gray or outright villainous characters. In Night in the City, directed by Jules Dassin, Widmark played a hustler named Harry Fabian, who scrambles through London's underworld in search of a big score. His portrayal was desperate and feverish, a far cry from the cackling, calculated cruelty of Tommy Udo. Though it shared the same noir DNA, it demonstrated Widmark's versatility. Even when playing shady characters, he approached them with different nuances, some cunning, some frantic, some tragic. In an unguarded interview from the late 1950s, Widmark confessed that he worried people would forever see him as the insane gangster. He longed for the chance to show other dimensions of his acting. He joked that when people recognized him in public, they'd sometimes back away fearfully or ask if he was as nuts in real life as the roles he played. It was said that one young woman even burst into tears upon seeing him in a diner, remembering only that terrifying wheelchair scene. While he was flattered by the impact of his performance, Widmark also yearned for roles that stretched beyond the dark corners of the criminal world. Hollywood can be strangely benevolent if you hang around long enough with the right attitude. The 1950s and early 1960s were marked by a boom in big-budget historical epics and westerns. Studios realized that as audiences transitioned to colored television in their homes, the silver screen needed to offer grander, more spectacular experiences. Westerns in particular exploded in popularity, sprawling cinemascope panoramas of rugged landscapes, heroic bandits, and moral showdowns. Widmark's chance to escape the villainous mold and stand in the sun came when directors like John Ford and Edward Dmytryk noticed that behind the menacing eyes lay a sincerity that could serve more heroic or conflicted roles. He took a significant step away from Noir and Panic in the Streets, 1950, directed by Elia Kazan, in which Widmark played a doctor desperately trying to contain an outbreak of pneumonic plague in New Orleans. Suddenly, viewers saw him as a man of conscience and reason, a far cry from the unhinged criminals who'd made him famous. But it was the Western genre that cemented Widmark's new identity. In films like Broken Lance, 1954, and The Last Wagon, 1956, he crafted portrayals of rugged individuals grappling with questions of justice and survival on the frontier. Here, audiences got to watch him ride horses across dusty plains, squint under a hot sun, and wrestle with moral dilemmas typical of the Old West. The transformation thrilled him. Where film noir was about cramped urban shadows, westerns offered wide-open skies, a slower pace, and the possibility of redemption. Widmark once commented that he felt freer in a saddle than under neon lights. He claimed the western set gave him room to breathe, physically and emotionally. Indeed, some behind-the-scenes anecdotes suggest he spent his off hours bonding with wranglers and picking up tips on roping or horse handling, determined to look natural in every shot. This gradual shift in roles paved the way for one of his most high-profile castings, Jim Bowie in John Wayne's The Alamo, 1960. Although the film was overshadowed by Wayne's larger-than-life presence both on and off camera, Widmark's portrayal of Bowie stood out as the thoughtful counterpoint to Wayne's Davy Crockett. Bowie was a legendary figure of American folklore, brash, courageous, stubborn. Widmark dug deeper, trying to present a Bowie who was vulnerable, even reflective, especially as the siege of the Alamo turned grim. He added subtle layers that fans of the film still discuss today, the quiet pain in Bowie's eyes as he realizes their cause might be hopeless, the flicker of humor even in dire moments. Off camera, rumors swirled that Wayne's robust patriotism and Widmark's more liberal political leanings sometimes led to mild tensions. They respected each other as professionals, but you might spot the occasional conversation between takes with each man standing his ground on certain views about politics or Hollywood's role in promoting American myths. Yet that tension served the film well, giving their on-screen dynamic a lived-in complexity. This might surprise some folks, but Richard Widmark was a vocal advocate for gun control at a time when that stance was not especially popular among Hollywood's leading men. He believed that violence in film, though often integral to the plot, could have real-world consequences if it was glorified without context. Some studio executives tried to downplay or hush these opinions, worrying that it might alienate a portion of the Western-loving audience. Yet Widmark didn't budge. In a rare 1971 interview, he reportedly said, "I know we can't do everything we'd like, but we'd better do something if we're going to remain civilized." That quiet resolution to speak his mind, even when it cut against the grain, was typical of Widmark. He cared about the humanity behind every role he took, and the same ethic guided him off-screen as well. Aside from the occasional friction with producers, his liberal politics never erupted into a major scandal. But they did frame a certain tension in his filmography, one that can be discerned in the characters he chose to play. Whether as a gun-toting cowboy, a troubled anti-hero, or a noble doctor, Widmark always projected a sense of conscience. Even at his darkest, like Tommy Udo, you felt there was an underlying commentary about the damage that desperation and psychological torment can cause. He was never just a cardboard cutout of evil. Behind the scenes, colleagues described him as approachable, respectful, and somewhat reserved. He'd give you a friendly nod on set, chat briefly, but rarely stayed out late partying. Instead, he returned to his hotel or trailer to prepare for the next day's scenes, a quiet devotion to the craft that he cultivated all his life. In the late 1950s, around the same period he was transitioning more solidly into westerns, Widmark also formed his own production company. Like many actors from his era, Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, he realized that creative control offered both financial independence and the freedom to develop projects that resonated with his own artistic vision. This was how he became involved in producing films such as Time Limit, 1957, which tackled the Korean War and the moral ambiguities of conflict. Directed by Carl Malden, Time Limit centered on a U.S. Army officer accused of collaborating with the enemy under severe pressure. Widmark took on the role of the investigator, Colonel William Edwards, and the film examined psychological trauma and moral responsibility in a way that was unusually nuanced for its time. While not a blockbuster, it showcased Widmark's interest in more thoughtful narratives beyond the standard studio fare. Marriage and family life for Widmark were mostly kept private, which wasn't unusual for that era. He and his wife, Jean Hazelwood, led a relatively stable life by Hollywood standards. They enjoyed dinner parties with a close circle of friends, many of them not in show business, and occasionally they retreated to their home in Connecticut for a change of pace. Friends of the couple sometimes remarked that Richard seemed most at ease in casual settings, tinkering with household projects or strolling through the woods near their property. Hollywood was a world he dipped into for work, but he never let it engulf him entirely. His devotion to Jean was evident, and they stayed married until her passing in 1997, an impressive decades-long partnership that contrasted sharply with the multiple breakups and scandals that beset many of their contemporaries. By the mid-1960s, Richard Widmark was widely recognized as one of Hollywood's most dependable leading men, a star who could anchor everything from a searing thriller to a sweeping historical piece. Yet he still faced the reality of typecasting, now of a different flavor, the moody Western hero. Films like Warlock, 1959, and Cheyenne Autumn, 1964, established him as an actor equally at home with grit and gravitas. In Cheyenne Autumn, directed by John Ford, Widmark played a cavalry officer empathetic to the plight of the Cheyenne people. This film, made when America was waking up to the civil rights movement, was a subtle commentary on government betrayal and racial injustice. Widmark's character was torn between duty and conscience, a moral quandary that felt in tune with the era's evolving social awareness. Though the film itself had a mixed reception, Widmark's performance received praise for its sober conviction. One lesser-known tidbit involves Widmark's short-lived period as a college instructor. After finishing his studies at Lake Forest College, he briefly returned there to teach acting and speech, a venture overshadowed by his later success. Students from that time described him as calm, meticulous, and always encouraging. He'd push them to find the emotional truth in their monologues or scenes. Decades later, a couple of those students turned up in interviews, recalling that even before his big Hollywood break, Widmark taught them that the key to a compelling performance lay in sincerity, in truly believing each line you deliver. It's a testament to how deeply he cared about the craft of acting, even before stardom became his reality. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Widmark continued to accept diverse roles. He co-starred in Judgment at Nuremberg, 1961, a powerfully dramatic film about the moral responsibility of judges under the Nazi regime. Though overshadowed by powerhouse performances from the likes of Spencer Tracy and Burt Lancaster, Widmark held his own, portraying the prosecuting attorney Colonel Tad Lawson. He injected the role with a righteous anger tinged with sorrow, a reflection of his belief that moral failings on such a grand scale demanded both accountability and empathy. He followed that with roles in thrillers and war films, sometimes returning to the noirish tension that had first made him a star. Even in lesser-known gems like The Bedford Incident, 1965, where he played a driven and increasingly paranoid naval officer, Widmark's ability to portray tightly coiled intensity remained unmatched. Yet by the late 1970s, Hollywood's love affair with westerns had cooled, overshadowed by gritty crime dramas, blockbuster action, and the rise of innovative directors who shook the film world's foundations. Widmark, already in his 60s, adapted to the shifting landscape by taking roles in television movies and miniseries. He wasn't the kind of actor who sneered at the small screen. On the contrary, he embraced the chance to keep working, refining his craft. One such project was the TV series Madigan, 1972 to 1973, a spin-off of the 1968 film in which he'd starred as Detective Daniel Madigan, a tough, streetwise cop. While short-lived, the show gave him a chance to connect with an entirely new generation of viewers who were more tuned into television than they were to the old Hollywood classics. Then there was his personal passion for philanthropy. Quietly, without splashy headlines, Widmark supported various charities, notably those focusing on children's health and educational programs. He remained proud of his own schooling background, crediting it with shaping his disciplined approach to acting. Whenever he had the chance, he visited college acting classes, encouraging students to look for the inner life of a character rather than just the flashy external details. He also found subtle ways to advocate for gun control and peaceful resolutions to conflict, in line with his personal convictions. It was never the focus of his public persona. He disliked sermonizing. But for those who listened, his consistent message was that every individual has a duty to contribute to the greater good. As with most long-standing careers, controversies occasionally brushed against Richard Widmark's name. One mild dispute concerned the filming of the Alamo. Some said Widmark had grown increasingly frustrated with John Wayne's sprawling directorial ambitions, going over budget and shooting for far longer than planned. Others pointed to political differences between Wayne and Widmark, Wayne's staunch conservatism clashing with Widmark's liberal streak. However, any friction seems to have been largely respectful. Wayne's son, Patrick, later remarked that Widmark was always professional and never disrupted the set, even if they didn't see eye to eye. It was more a case of two strong personalities, each with distinct visions, finding common ground in mutual respect for the story they were telling. Another point of debate arises among film scholars who argue about how exactly to categorize Widmark's style. Was he a method actor in the tradition of Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift? Or was he more of a traditional performer shaped by the studio system? Opinions differ, but the consensus is that Widmark had an intuitive grasp of emotional truth, honed during his time in radio and on stage. He seldom resorted to elaborate method techniques like staying in character off set. Rather, he studied his scripts meticulously and constructed his roles with care, layering in quiet details. Some critics highlight his ability to convey moral conflict with just a shift of expression, a skill that might link him to classic Hollywood acting traditions. Others see in his darker portrayals a kind of proto-method realism, especially in those intense early roles. As the 1980s marched forward, Widmark's appearances on screen became less frequent. The film industry favored younger stars, and the older generation of classic actors found themselves with narrower options. But Widmark never completely disappeared. He'd show up in small parts or cameo appearances in TV shows, and still pop up on talk shows, where hosts loved to get him reminiscing about the old days of noir and westerns. Though less visible, he was not forgotten. Fans of classic cinema rediscovered Kiss of Death, Night and the City, or Pickup on South Street, 1953, reveling in the taut intensity that Widmark uniquely delivered. New waves of cinephiles admired the moral complexity of his Western heroes, finding them more nuanced than some of the formulaic gunslingers prevalent in mid-century cinema. Personal tragedy struck when Widmark's beloved wife, Jean Hazelwood, passed away in 1997. The couple had been married for 55 years, an almost unheard-of record in Hollywood. Friends worried that Widmark would retreat entirely from public life. For a short while he did, emerging only sporadically. But in 1999 he surprised many by marrying Susan Blanchard, who had been Henry Fonda's third wife. The two had known each other through social circles, and while some in the press sniffed at the union, given that both were well into their 70s, it seemed to provide Widmark with companionship and warmth in his later years. If there's one facet of Widmark's life that remains somewhat hidden from mainstream accounts, it's the personal letters he wrote during the filming of various projects. Some of these letters, discovered in private collections, reveal a man who was keenly aware of social issues and deeply curious about the moral dilemmas his roles presented. For instance, in correspondence with a friend during the shooting of Cheyenne Autumn, Widmark expressed frustration that the film didn't delve deeply enough into the atrocities committed against Native Americans, writing that, "We have a duty to show more than just a cavalry chase. We owe truth to the people whose story this really is." Another letter to a college buddy from the 1950s shows Widmark wrestling with the violence of his gangster characters, pondering if he was contributing to a culture of brutality. This introspection adds a layer of depth to our understanding of a man often hailed for his menacing characters, but who in real life was anything but a caricature of evil. In terms of controversy, some film historians point to how Widmark's shift from gangster to Western star paralleled Hollywood's broader pivot. They argue that by moving into Westerns, Widmark was effectively turning his back on the critical lens of film noir, which laid bare the moral ambiguities of post-war society. They wonder if he simply followed the money and mainstream acceptance, or if he legitimately wanted to embrace more heroic roles as a personal statement. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. While he did enjoy the commercial and creative possibilities of Westerns, Widmark never seemed to lose his fascination with complex moral landscapes. He just explored them in a different setting. And perhaps the popularity of the Western offered a more certain paycheck in an uncertain industry. After all, typecasting can be a career killer, but it can also be a life raft if you find a genre you can thrive in. Richard Widmark's consequences for film history are still felt today. One of the enduring outcomes of his career is the example he set for the crossover actor who can play both villain and hero convincingly. Hollywood typically loves to pigeonhole talents. Once a gangster, always a gangster, but Widmark shattered that notion. By moving seamlessly from the malevolent Tommy Udo to nuanced Western heroes and historical icons like Jim Bowie, he helped pave the way for subsequent generations of actors who refused to be boxed in. Think of performers like Bryan Cranston, who jumped from comedic roles to terrifying dramatic performances, or Gary Oldman, known for an astonishing range of characters. Their versatility stands on the shoulders of actors like Widmark, who took risks at a time when the studio system was less flexible. Another crucial part of Widmark's legacy is the moral complexity he insisted on bringing to his roles. Whether playing villain or hero, he strove to emphasize the human aspect of his characters, the contradictions that make a person tick. In a world where many classic Hollywood leading men were either squeaky clean or irredeemably evil, Widmark showed that a hero can harbor doubts, and a villain might have once been an ordinary man led astray. That layering of motives resonated with audiences, who recognized that reality seldom sorts people into neat categories. As the years went by, film noir enthusiasts revered him as one of the genre's icons, while Western fans cherished him for bringing a certain psychological depth to frontier justice. He died on March 24, 2008, at his home in Roxbury, Connecticut, at the age of 93. The cause was complications after a fall, and although his passing garnered respectful obituaries, it didn't spark the kind of widespread media frenzy we see with many modern film stars. Nevertheless, in the days and weeks that followed, movie channels aired tributes, critics penned articles, and longtime fans gathered online to share memories and favorite scenes. Among the recollections shared was one from a crew member who had worked with Widmark on Judgment at Nuremberg. The man recalled how, after a particularly heavy day of shooting war crime testimony scenes, Widmark invited him for a quiet cup of coffee and simply asked how he was holding up. That small kindness in the face of such a grim and intense film spoke volumes to the crew member, who said it cemented Widmark in his mind as not only a great actor but a great human being. Looking back, it's hard not to see Richard Widmark as a representative of a Hollywood that no longer exists. He rose at a time when the big studios signed lengthy contracts with actors, shaping their careers with carefully chosen roles and promotional strategies. He thrived through the transitional years of the early television era, weathered the storm of changing tastes in the 1960s and 1970s, and gracefully segued into a slower pace of life as a revered elder statesman of cinema. Along the way, he carved out a reputation for reliability and excellence, a man who gave his all, whether playing a dangerously unstable gangster or a folk hero from American history. In revisiting his story, perhaps we're reminded that even in an industry often fueled by glamour, gossip, and spectacle, substance can still shine through. Widmark's unwavering dedication to performance and quiet stance on social issues show that an actor can hold personal convictions without turning them into grandstanding. He chose projects that interested him, took creative control when he could, and made sure each role had honesty behind it. That kind of integrity might not always make headlines, but it leaves a mark on film culture that endures long after the latest Hollywood trends fade. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.